The summer of 1971 was the kind that made men doubt themselves, not because of the heat alone. Though the heat was real, thermometers in Calloway County, Kentucky, hitting 103 for 11 days straight in July, the air sitting thick and unmoving over the fields like something had died in it. No, what made men doubt themselves that summer was the silence. No rain, no wind, no relief coming from any direction any instrument could measure, just the slow, patient cracking of the topsoil and the sound of corn leaves curling inward to protect whatever moisture they still held. It was in that summer, specifically on the 14th of July, a Wednesday, with the sky white and the ground hard as fired brick, that Earl Whitfield walked the length of the dry gulch on the eastern edge of his property and decided he was going to dam it. He was 61 years old. He had farmed these 280 acres since 1938, when his father handed him the deed in a handshake and died 4 days later of a stroke in the barn. He had no formal education past the 8th grade. He drove a 1954 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield he had fixed with electrical tape, and he wore the same style of canvas work coat in every season, simply adding layers underneath when winter came. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who needed to. He walked the gulch slowly that Wednesday morning, carrying a wooden surveying rod he had made himself from a straight-cut length of hickory, marked in half-inch increments with a wood-burning tool. He stopped every 20 feet or so, pushed the rod into the earth at different angles, knelt and pressed his palm flat against the clay subsoil, then stood and walked on. He did this for 2 hours. He made small marks in a soft-cover notebook with a short pencil he kept behind his ear. When he reached the natural narrowing point, a place where 2 limestone outcroppings pinched the gulch to a width of 31 feet, he stopped, looked north up the length of the draw, then south toward his lower fields, then north again. He wrote one number in his notebook, 31. Then he walked home, ate a cold lunch alone at his kitchen table, and began sketching. The sketch was not complicated. A simple earthen dam across the narrowest point of the gulch, built from the clay subsoil he already knew was abundant along the draw. He had been pulling it up on his plow blade for 30 years. The dam would catch whatever rain did come, even light rain, and hold it. Given the shape of the watershed, above roughly 140 acres of sloped farmland and scrub timber, draining into that single narrow channel, even an inch of rain would send considerable water through. He calculated the storage volume at the base of the gulch conservatively. He wrote the number in his notebook. He looked at it for a while. He circled it. The next morning, he drove to the Calloway County Farm Bureau meeting at the grain elevator on Route 9. He had not planned to say anything. He went most months and sat in the back and listened. But when Harlan Birch, the county extension agent, 34 years old, fresh from the University of Kentucky's agricultural program with a master's degree he mentioned in most conversations, opened the floor for discussion about the drought and what measures farmers were considering. Earl raised his hand. He stood up. He was not a tall man, but he was wide through the shoulders, and when he stood in a room, people noticed it. He explained the gulch. He explained the clay subsoil. He explained the watershed acreage above. He said he intended to build an earthen dam, 31 feet across at the base, using the native clay, compacted in 6-inch lifts and packed wet. He said he expected it to fill within the first or second good rain year, and that once filled, the stored water would irrigate his lower 40 acres through a simple gravity-fed pipe he would run from the base of the structure. He said the whole project would cost him less than $200 in materials and a few weeks of his own labor. He sat down. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Then Harlan Birch laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has studied a subject formally and finds himself confronted with an answer that violates what he was taught. It was the laugh of someone who genuinely cannot locate the idea within any framework he has been given. He covered his mouth briefly with his notepad, then set it down and smiled at the room. "Earl," he said pleasantly, "clay dams are what failed all across this region in the 30s. The literature is pretty clear on that. Without proper engineering specs, without a concrete spillway, without compaction testing, you're going to build a mud pile, and the first heavy rain's going to take it right down the Gulch and into your south field." 2 or 3 farmers nodded. One, Dale Perkins, who ran 400 acres 2 miles east and had just taken delivery of a new center pivot irrigation system he was still making payments on, turned in his chair to say something to the man beside him. The man beside him smiled. Someone near the back made a comment Earl didn't fully hear, but the laughter that followed it was clear enough. Earl did not respond. He took the short pencil from behind his ear, opened his notebook, and wrote something. Then he put the pencil back and looked forward. Harlan continued. He talked about proper irrigation infrastructure, about the new cost-share programs through the state, about modern PVC piping and pump systems. He was not unkind about it. He simply moved on. Earl's idea was filed, in the minds of most people in that room, under the category of old man stubbornness, harmless, slightly sad, not worth further discussion. Earl drove home. He ate dinner. He went to bed at 9. On the 1st of August, he started building. He had thought through every element of it over the previous 2 weeks. And he built it the way his father had described building the small stock ponds on the home place in eastern Tennessee in the 1920s, the way men built water structures before engineers were consulted, before anyone thought you needed a degree to understand how water and earth behaved together. He excavated the base of the dam by hand and with his old Ford tractor, a 1948 Ford 8N he had purchased used in 1952 and maintained himself ever since. He cut down to solid subsoil 3 feet below grade to set the foundation, a practice he had seen described in a 1931 soil conservation bulletin he kept in a cardboard box in his tool shed, along with 30 years of other farm publications. He hauled the native clay in his wagon, wet it from his stock tank, and packed it in layers. 6 inches wet, then a pass with the rear tires of the 8N to compact it, then 6 more inches. He built the upstream face of the dam with a gradual slope and packed it tight. The downstream face he built steeper and seeded immediately with a grass mix fescue and orchard grass to hold the face against erosion. At the 31-foot mark, he left an opening for a 4-inch steel pipe threaded with a hand valve. He had driven to Paducah to buy the pipe fittings, spending $43. He set the pipe at the lowest point of what would become the pool, angled south, so that water would gravity feed directly downslope toward his lower fields when he opened the valve. He packed clay around the pipe in careful stages, tamping it by hand, making certain there was no path for water to track along the outside of the pipe and undermine the structure. The spillway he built from flat limestone he pulled from the Gulch walls, heavy slabs, he moved with a pry bar and chain, and the patience of a man who does not own a backhoe and has never thought of that as a handicap. He set the stones level at 3 feet below the top of the dam, creating an overflow channel that would carry any surplus water safely around the structure and down the original Gulch channel. He mortared the stones with a mix he made himself. He finished the dam on the 22nd of September. He had worked on it 41 days, never more than 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, fitting it around his regular farm work. The dam sat dry. The gulch above it was cracked and pale. The sky offered nothing. He drove past it on his way to the back field. He did not stop to look at it particularly. It was built. It would either work or it would not, and the answer would come in time. That winter was dry. January brought 2 light snows that melted quickly. February brought nothing. The dam held its empty shape. Earl went about his winter work equipment, maintenance, fence repair, planning his spring planting, and said nothing about it to anyone. In March of 1972, Dale Perkins stopped by. He came to borrow a fence stretcher, which Earl lent him, and then he said, standing by his truck, that he had noticed Earl had built something out on the east draw. Earl said yes. Dale said he supposed it hadn't filled yet. Earl said no, not yet. Dale nodded slowly in the particular way of a man who has already made up his mind about something and is simply being courteous enough not to say it plainly. He got in his truck and drove out. April of 1972 brought rain. Not a little rain. Not a gentle April shower that softened the memory of drought. April of 1972 brought 4 inches in the first week, 2 more in the third week, and a steady gray week at the end of the month that added another 1.5 inches. The county received more rain in April 1972 than it had in any single month in the previous 4 years combined. The creeks ran. The fields stood in shallow water. Farmers who had planted early lost seed to waterlogged ground and replanted at a loss. Earl Whitfield walked out to the East Gulch on the morning of April 9th. The water was already 4 feet up the face of the dam, moving, alive, carrying silt and leaf litter and the color of the red clay subsoil in a slow, purposeful current. He stood on top of the structure and looked north up the draw. The entire watershed above was draining exactly as he had calculated. The limestone spillway was still dry. The pool had not yet reached that level, but it would. He came back on the 12th. The water was 8 feet up, still rising, 2 feet below the spillway stones. He came back on the 19th. The pool was full. The spillway was running a thin, even sheet of water moving across the limestone in exactly the way he had intended, carrying nothing with it but water, no erosion, no breach, no loss of structure. The pool behind the dam stretched 180 feet up the gulch. It was deep enough in the center that he could not see the bottom. He opened the 4-inch valve. The water ran south through the pipe, down the slope, and spread across the lower 40 acres in a slow fan. He watched it move through the dry grass of the field edge and disappear into the soil. He stood there for a while. Then he closed the valve, walked back to his tractor, and drove to the far field to check on his corn planting. He did not tell anyone. He did not drive to the Farm Bureau. He did not call Harlan Birch. There was nothing to say. The thing worked. That was the end of the matter, as far as he was concerned. Word traveled, as it always does in a county of 8,000 people, through the natural channels available to it. The grain elevator, the co-op, the counter at Dixon's Hardware. By June, most of the farming community in that part of Calloway County knew that Earl Whitfield's clay dam had filled and was holding. Some people drove out to look at it from the road. Most said nothing. A few mentioned it to their wives. Dale Perkins drove past twice in the same week and did not stop. The summer of 1972 was dry again, not as bad as 1971, but dry enough that the new center pivot systems were running daily and the electric bills were climbing. Earl opened his valve for 2 hours in the morning, 3 times a week, and his lower 40 acres stayed green. His corn yield that year was 94 bushels per acre. The county average was 71. He said nothing about this either. The drought that people in Calloway County would call the bad one, the one they measured everything else against for the rest of their lives, came in the summer of 1978. It began in May with a dry spring planting season that forced everyone to irrigate from the start. By June, the water table was dropping fast. By July, the shallower farm wells, the ones drilled to 60 or 80 feet in the 1950s and early 60s, were pulling air. A farmer named Cecil Holt, who ran 180 acres north of Route 9, lost his well entirely on the 12th of July. He had to haul water in a tank truck for his livestock for 11 weeks. His neighbor's well went dry 2 weeks after that. By August, 17 farms in the county had reported wells either failed or severely diminished. Harlan Birch, now 41 and the district's senior extension agent, was driving his truck in circles trying to advise people who had no good options. Dale Perkins' center pivot system ran on water drawn from a shallow well he had drilled in 1969. That well dropped to 5 gallons per minute in early July, not enough to run the pivot at anything close to its designed capacity. By the last week of July, it was drawing silt. He shut it down on the 29th of July rather than burn out the pump. He stood in his field and looked at 400 acres of corn in the pollination stage, with no irrigation water and no rain in the forecast. He drove to Earl Whitfield's farm the next morning. Earl was in his machine shed when Dale's truck pulled in a new Chevy Silverado 1977 dark blue, still clean despite the drought dust that covered everything that summer. Dale got out slowly. He was 52 years old, and he looked tired in the way that men look tired when they have been carrying something heavier than physical work. He stood by his truck for a moment. Earl came out of the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. "Earl," Dale said, "I need to ask you something." Earl nodded. "You're damn." Dale looked at his boots. Then he looked up. "Is it still holding?" Earl said yes. Dale was quiet for a moment. "I've got corn going into tassel on 80 acres of bottom ground. My well's gone. I don't have enough water to save the whole field, but if I could get water on those 80 acres for the next 3 weeks," he stopped. He was not a man accustomed to asking for things. "I want to know if I could run a temporary line from your pond down through the fence line to my east field. I'll pay you whatever you think is fair. I'll put the line in myself and I'll take it out when it's done." Earl looked at him for a few seconds. "You don't need to pay me," he said. "Run your line." Dale opened his mouth and closed it. He nodded once, slowly. "Thank you, Earl." Earl went back into the shed. There was a moment Dale standing by his truck, hand on the door handle, looking at the back of the machine shed where Earl had disappeared, that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Dale Perkins understood something about the distance between what he had thought in 1971 and what he knew in 1978, and the understanding was not comfortable, and he did not try to make it comfortable. He got in his truck and drove home to get his fittings and pipe. Harlan Birch heard about it through the county office on the second day of August. By that time, two other farmers had called Earl directly. One of them, a man named Tommy Aldridge, who had been sitting near the back of that 1971 Farm Bureau meeting and had made some comment that produced laughter and asked the same question Dale had asked. Earl said yes to both of them. He had, by that point, 7 acres of his own corn and 14 acres of soybeans on his lower ground still growing without stress. His pool, even after 7 years of seasonal use, was holding at roughly 80% capacity. The drought had dropped it some evaporation, the regular draws he made for his own fields, but the clay base had done what clay does when properly prepared. It had sealed itself over time, the fine particles migrating and filling every microvoid in the structure until the bottom of the pool was as watertight as a bathtub. He was drawing on water that had fallen as rain in April and June, stored patiently in the earth he had packed with his own hands. Harlan Birch drove out on a Thursday afternoon in early August. He pulled up in the county's white pickup and sat for a moment before getting out. He was carrying a yellow legal pad, which he held against his chest with one arm as he walked toward the barn where Earl was working on a cultivator. "Earl," he said. Earl looked up. "I've got 7 farms in the county with failed wells," Harlan said. "I've got 3 more that are going to fail before September." He paused. "Can I look at your structure?" Earl put down his wrench and walked him out to the east gulch. Harlan stood at the top of the dam for a long time without speaking. He looked at the pool, still full enough to hold a reflection of the white August sky, and at the limestone spillway, and at the downstream face, seeded with fescue that had now had 7 years to develop a root system. He crouched and put his hand against the compacted clay face of the dam. He pressed it. He stood up and looked north up the draw at the watershed above. He wrote something on his legal pad. Then he was quiet for a while longer. "How deep is the pool in the center?" he asked. "About 11 feet at full," Earl said. "It's probably at 8 right now." Harlan wrote something else. He looked at the stone spillway. "You mortared those yourself?" "Yes." "What mix?" Earl told him. Harlan wrote it down. He turned and looked at the downstream face again. He looked at the pipe and valve. He was quiet for almost a full minute. "The literature I was trained on," Harlan said, finally, still looking at the dam rather than at Earl, addressed clay dams that failed. They failed because the foundation wasn't cut deep enough, or the compaction wasn't done in lifts, or the spillway wasn't designed to handle overflow without eroding the face. He paused. "You did all of those things." "Yes," Earl said. "How did you know to do them?" Earl thought about this for a moment. "My father talked about building stock ponds in Tennessee when he was young, and I read everything I could find from the old conservation bulletins. 1930, 31, 32. The federal soil people wrote a lot down during the Depression because people needed to do things cheap. Most of that knowledge didn't make it into what they teach in the universities." Harlan looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it did." They stood together for another moment without speaking. The surface of the pool was still. A red-winged blackbird moved across the far end of it and disappeared into the scrub at the upper end of the draw. "I'd like to write this up," Harlan said, "for the district bulletin, with your permission, so other farmers can build something like this." "You can do that," Earl said. They walked back to the barn. At his truck, Harlan stopped and turned. He was holding his legal pad at his side now. "I said some things in 1971 that were wrong," he said. He said it plainly, the way a man says something he has already decided to say and does not intend to walk back. "I was going off what I'd been taught, and I didn't take the time to understand what you actually knew. I'm sorry for that." Earl looked at him steadily. "You were working from what you had," he said. "Most people do." Harlan nodded. He got in his truck. He drove out slowly on the gravel lane. Earl went back to the cultivator. The district bulletin ran in October of 1978. Harlan's write-up was 2 pages detailed, technical, specific about the construction methods, the compaction process, the spillway design, the foundation depth. He cited Earl Whitfield by name throughout. He included a photograph Dale Perkins had taken of the pool at full capacity in the spring. The bulletin went to every extension office in western Kentucky and was reprinted in the following year by extension services in Tennessee and Missouri. The dam itself continued to fill every spring and to deliver water through its 4-inch pipe every dry summer for the rest of Earl's farming years. He opened the valve in 1979, 1980, 1983, 1984, 1986, 1988. Every dry year, the region produced. The pool was there, having stored whatever rain had come in the wetter months and held it in its clay-sealed basin through the heat. He repaired the downstream face seeding twice in 30 years, after 2 particularly wet winters scoured some of the vegetative cover. He replaced the steel valve once, in 1989, when the original began to corrode. Both repairs cost him less than $80 combined. Dale Perkins changed the way he thought about his farm after 1978. He kept the center pivot system. It was paid off by then, and it worked well enough in normal years, but he spent the winter of 1978 and 1979 reading everything he could find about earthen water storage. He built 2 smaller earthen ponds on his property the following spring, neither as large as Earl's dam, both using the principles Harlan had described in the bulletin. By 1983, he had enough stored surface water that his dependence on the groundwater well was minimal. He told this to anyone at the Farm Bureau who would listen. When men asked him where he'd gotten the idea, he said Earl Whitfield's name without hesitation and without decoration. Just the name. That was sufficient. Harlan Birch retired from the Extension Service in 1994. In his final district address given at the same grain elevator on Route 9, where he had laughed in 1971, he talked about the things his formal education had prepared him for and the things it had not. He did not name Earl specifically in the address, but anyone in the county who heard it knew who he was talking about when he said that the most durable agricultural knowledge he had encountered in 30 years of extension work had come from farmers who had learned not from institutions, but from necessity, from careful observation, and from the hard inheritance of practical wisdom passed down through generations that had no margin for error. Earl Whitfield did not attend the retirement dinner. He sent a card. He was busy with his fall disking. He farmed until 1998, when he was 88 years old, and his knees made it impossible to climb onto the 8N without help he was unwilling to ask for. He sold the tractor that year to a young man named Kevin Holt, nephew of the same Cecil Holt, whose well had gone dry in 1978, and rented the cropland out to a neighboring operation, while keeping his house and garden and a small flock of chickens. The dam remained. His son, Raymond, who had grown up watching his father walk that gulch with a hickory rod and a short pencil, took over the maintenance of the structure. He regraded the downstream face one more time in 2001. He kept the valve operable. He opened it in dry summers and watched the water run south across the lower ground the way it always had, slow and even and patient. In 2004, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky's agricultural engineering program drove out to Calloway County to study the structure for a thesis on traditional earth and water management in the Mid-South. She spent 2 days on the property, measuring and photographing and taking core samples of the compacted clay. She interviewed Raymond, who told her what he remembered of his father building it, and she pulled the relevant sections of the 1978 District Bulletin, which she found in the University Library's Extension archives. She asked Raymond what year the dam had been built. He said 1971. She looked at her notes and then at the structure, and then back at her notes. "It's been holding for 33 years?" she said. 33, Raymond said. "And my father used it for 27 of those before he stopped farming." She walked back out to the top of the dam and stood there for a while looking at the pool. It was May. The pool was full. The limestone spillway was running a thin, clear sheet over its flat stones, exactly as designed, carrying the surplus of a wet spring safely around the structure and back into the lower channel. She wrote in her thesis, which was completed the following year and accepted without revision, that the Whitfield Dam represented a category of vernacular engineering built from local materials, local knowledge, and local observation that formal agricultural education had systematically undervalued for decades, often at significant cost to the farmers who relied on that education when their own traditional knowledge would have served them better. The thesis committee accepted this conclusion without objection. Earl Whitfield died in February of 2005 at the age of 94. He died in his own house, in his own bed, on a cold, clear morning with no particular drama. The obituary in the Calloway County paper was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his years of service on the county soil conservation board, his membership in the local church, and his surviving family. It mentioned, in the 3rd paragraph, that he had built an earthen dam on his property in 1971 that had supplied irrigation water to his farm for 27 years and had been the subject of extension publications throughout the region. It did not mention that people had laughed. It did not need to. The dam is still there. The pool fills every spring. The valve still works. The limestone spillway still carries the overflow in wet years in a thin, even sheet across its flat stones, and the downstream face holds its seeding of fescue and orchard grass the way it has held it for 5 decades. The roots running deep into the packed clay that an old man built by hand in the heat of a dry August, one 6-inch layer at a time. The water stored in that pool has no memory of the meeting at the grain elevator on Route 9, or the laughter, or the extension agent's formal certainty. It simply does what water does when someone understands it well enough to give it a place to stay. What a man builds from honest knowledge outlasts what others think of it.